how would you respond to the question, or the proposition rather, that degrowth is bad branding? Because nobody likes to degrow, right? We like growth. Right. We like children growing. We like businesses growing. We like families growing. We like personal growth.
Yeah, I think that I'm actually not against that claim. I think it might be, in fact, but it was never really meant to be branding. Like, it was meant to be an analytical term. I think it's very useful as an analytical term for scientists, for academics, and I think also within the climate movements, within the left, etc., within socialist movements, and so on. I think that is actually like a really important term that we need to help us rethink what is the objective of the economy, and certain key things that we have to achieve, like degrowing, damaging, and unnecessary capitalist industries. Right, that's actually something we have to do. But I really don't think it ever was intended to be a public-facing term. Certainly never one that a political movement should use at the podium, because obviously it is very prone to misunderstanding, and can even create antagonisms. Now, what's interesting is that the people who coined the term actually liked it for that reason. It's an interesting history. They considered it what they call a missile word, and they liked it because if you say to somebody, we need ecological sustainability, or we need to green our economy, they're gonna be like, yeah, I agree with that. If you start talking about, we're gonna have to scale down certain forms of production, and particularly the consumption of the ruling class, let's say, then this will create a conflict, right? And so degrowth is actually is useful to the extent that it creates antagonisms, that words like green economy don't, and this helps us have a conversation about what's going on and what's actually needed. So I think it can be useful in that way. People's immediate reaction is, that sounds absolutely crazy. And then they start to think about it and they're like, well, that sounds fairly reasonable. So I think it can be useful as kind of a tool for intellectual development, let's say. I mean, when I first heard it, I had a very negative reaction against it. In fact, I was like, this is crazy. And in fact, it's very clear that economies do need to grow all the time. And this is what I learned in my economics classes. And that's how you maintain a stable economy. And degrowth is an affront to that assumption. And then it forces you to think, wait a second, do economies really need to grow all the time? Like, should the US economy keep increasing aggregate output, even though it has worse social outcomes than European economies with half the GDP per capita, right? This doesn't make any sense. And so I think it triggers a process of introspection. But I really don't think that anyone, again, needs to be using it at the podium. It should be an analytical term, I think, primarily. And ultimately, also, here's the other key thing, is that people talk about there's a degrowth movement and a degrowth agenda and all that, right? I just don't think that either of these things exist. I mean, obviously, the idea has become very popular in scientific circles and in climate circles, but there's no political movement around degrowth that could actually achieve power and implement, policy. And I think that the suggesting that the existing ruling class would implement degrowth, in other words, scale down unnecessary production, increase necessary production, this is a fantasy. It's not going to happen, right? Because this is not...
But there are mainstream parties with a similar-ish platform like the Green Party in this country. I mean, they can end up in the next election with 15, 20 MPs. I mean, that's a substantial number of representatives. So it kind of does matter, no? In terms of the...
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I mean, fair enough. But the Green Party, I wouldn't call it it's not a mainstream capitalist party, right?
No, but it's
actually an anti-capitalist.
They talk about, yeah, exactly.
It's actually an anti-capitalist
They would
party,
talk about degrowth and so on.
So if the Green Party takes power, then we've effectively had a socialist revolution, isn't it? and this is the point I want to make, is that the things that degrowth calls for cannot happen within capitalism. It's antithetical to capitalism. And in fact, this is the reason why degrowth gets so much hate. It's interesting. I had a conversation with a leading figure of degrowth recently, and I was like, well, we actually should stop using the term because people hate it. And he was like, you have to understand, people don't hate it because it sounds negative. They hate it because they can see that it's anti-capitalist. They hate it because it's very apparent that this is against the interests of capital accumulation, and furthermore, requires democratic control over production and planning, right? Because you're going to have to plan the downscaling of some forms of production and the upscaling of others. This cannot occur under capitalism as we know it. And so that's why there's a backlash from the right. And so I think that given that fact, what we actually want to do is play into that terrain more directly. Like, let's rid ourselves of the confusion. This is really about class struggle. This is really about who controls the means of production.
Well, quite.
And so let's make the movement actually is socialism.
Yeah.
We have to build a movement for socialism that has the possibility of taking power and removing overcoming capitalist control of production, asserting democratic control over our own productive capacities so that we can address our social and ecological crises. That's the movement. That's the objective. I think that degrowth is properly understood as a piece of socialist transformation that applies specifically to rich countries. And again, I think one of the major misunderstandings of degrowth, and this is another reason why it triggers so much anger, is that people immediately think, oh, this is about denying development to the global south. No, it is fundamentally the opposite of that. It is specifically targeted at those nations that dramatically overshoot their planetary boundaries and have to reduce material and energy use to achieve sustainability. That does not apply to countries in the imperial periphery, where we know that in most cases, they need to increase their use of energy and resources to build out the infrastructure necessary to ensure good lives for all, right? So that entails aggregate increasing production, in other words, growth. Of course, a socialist development project in the periphery, like in China now, should not target growth for its own sake, but should target the necessary forms of production for human well-being. And right now, in most global south countries, that would entail an aggregate increase in production. So that's the key, I think. I think that the socialism is the main objective here. And should be our rallying cry.
The thing you said about GDP not really reflecting how successful a society is, you keep on seeing these memes online about the Euro pause from Americans, and they'll say Mississippi has a higher GDP, or it's the only state with a lower GDP per capita.
This is a good one.
Than France. And I go, have you been to France? Like, okay, France has problems like anywhere else. It has France. Forget Mississippi, has a longer life expectancy than the United States, some of the longest lived people in the world. It has almost all of its electricity being generated by nuclear power. It has some of the best food and produce in the world. It's the world's 4th largest wheat producer. It has some of the best public transport on earth. It has gorgeous, glorious history. I mean, look at how quickly they rebuilt the Notre Dame Cathedral. I know with private capital, but it required, including private capital, but it required a level of state coordination that actually this country doesn't have. And it was people don't know this. The rebuilding of Notre Dame was overseen by a French general. The guy died just before it finished. But it's quite interesting where you need to do something at this national prestige project. They don't get some like business CEO, they get a general. And I think that says something quite interesting about the state. France, Spain, go to these countries. These are some of the most successful countries on earth. The idea that like some poor US state, you go to a town or a city in Mississippi and then go to Orléans or go to Zaragoza or Valencia. Tell me which one's a more successful society.
Think about it.
It's pretty obvious. I wanted to just go back though to this point about degrowth and branding. Because I sometimes will criticize the folk politics of degrowth, to be clear. Not what you're talking about, not this book, because reducing exchange value, maximizing use value is the classical socialist project, right? And I think degrowth is a very clean analytical way of describing it. But there is, maybe you disagree, there is a kind of folk politics of degrowth, and I've met these people where they say, we need to degrow the economy, and that's why I don't hoover my house anymore.
Right.
Now, when I say this on YouTube, people try and cancel me. I've literally met people like this. I've stopped hoovering the house. We've stopped eating meat. Good. But then I find out actually they eat a ton of eggs and avocados and produce from elsewhere. So there's this kind of folk politics of degrowth, which actually A, doesn't achieve what it sets out to do anyway, but B, means that you regress on quite fundamental gains in the 20th century. Like, and again, I'm not joking, washing machines, hoovering, even just using the bus, right? I would never, get on something. Some people do say this. I've not met personally the person that says that. I've seen it, but I have met the people that won't use the hoovers and the washing machines or will use them less. I'll give you a really classic example here. Dishwashers, and I know there's a bunch of embodied carbon within the machine itself, but they use less water than when you wash with hand. They use less energy, and they obviously save time. So in terms of labor substitution, I think that's quite a smart device. In terms of inbuilt obsolescence, they should last longer, et cetera, but I think that's quite a smart thing.
Totally.
There is this folk politics where it's like, no, do it by hand. Primitivism. Do you meet those people, or am I being...
I'm very strongly against it for lots of reasons. Let's get into this. I think it's empirically and also politically wrong. I would say this is actually closer to, it's a folk politics of degrowth, that's true, but I would say it's basically a dominant position within what I would call a kind of bourgeois green politics, right? This idea that ultimately the problem is individual patterns of consumption. And so therefore, it's a politics of guilt, right? We should all feel guilty. We consume too much. We should therefore try to constrain our consumption, take shorter showers, stop eating meat, compost, and recycle, and things like this, right? By the way, all of these things can actually be effective. These people are doing good things by their own standards, sure. But ultimately, this will not actually overcome the problems we face because it's not actually about consumption. Consumption is in fact downstream from the production system. This is crucial to understand. And so what really matters here is what is being produced and under what conditions. And us taking shorter showers and composting and so on, right, does not in fact change the structure of production. And so ultimately, this is a completely failed political approach that can't achieve its objectives, but also furthermore, absolutely alienates the working classes, right? And so you have, and this is maybe not true of the UK Green Party, which I think is actually fairly socialist, and has very good policy approaches for the most part. But if you look at like the German Greens, right? So you have these like sort of middle upper class German Green folks who go around talking about how we consume too much, blah blah. You think that can connect with the German working class who are living hand to mouth in some cases, like barely making ends meet, being told that they consume too much? Is actually crazy, And so I think that you need a much more structural analysis. And this is in fact what degrowth provides when you dig behind the label, and actually understand what the academics are saying about this, which is that, for example, the UK, the US, for example, in particular, has very high level of material use, okay? Now, even if you were to dig into the class dimensions of this, you might find that the working classes also have high material use. Now, why is that? Is it because they're just like rampant consumers? No, it's because the structure of their provisioning systems is highly materially intensive. And so public transport is not provided. Everybody has to own a car and they've got to drive that to get to work, right? The rental stock is massively substandard, totally inefficient. They have inefficient appliances. All of this drives up their energy use, et cetera. And so their so-called energy footprints or the carbon footprint might actually be high, but through no fault of their own. It's due to the provisioning systems of the economy, and which are a result of having a capitalist economy, right? And so in a situation where you have, socialist democratic control over production, you can very quickly ensure people's provisioning is improved, like mobility access can go up with public transit, et cetera, with a lot less energy and materials. And that's what has to be achieved. And so the idea that this is about individual responsibility is completely misguided. And capital loves this idea. You can see like major fossil fuel firms invest in promoting this idea of the individual carbon footprints.
Didn't they came up with it, right?
I think they might have even come up with it.
I think Shell came up with it.
Was it Shell or BP or something like that, yeah. And so I think we have to get away from that kind of politics. This is the structural problem about the production system. Again, I've got to emphasize, the ecological crisis is 100% an effect of the production system. That is it. It's about who controls production and what we're producing and who benefits from it. Simple as that. And that's ultimately what we're going to have to tackle, I think. So we have to get away from bourgeois green politics and move towards something like eco-socialist politics, where ecology is alongside human welfare as main objectives for the economy.